Hello and welcome to this, the last major unit on normative ethical theories. We're going to be taking a departure away from action-based theories of ethics like utilitarianism or Kant's theory or even Ross's theory, and instead taking a look at a different basis for taking a look at moral questions, and that is something known as virtue ethics. Since virtue ethics is actually the oldest form of ethics in the Western tradition, it goes all the way back to Aristotle, um, back in the 4th century BC, to ancient Athens. We'll be taking a look at Aristotle's formulation of virtue ethics because most of the vocabulary and concepts are drawn from Aristotle's sort of very excellent proposal for how to study ethics. It comes from a book called the Nicomachean Ethics, and there's some dispute. Of course, Aristotle's son Nicomachus is who the book was dedicated to. I think that's the most likely explanation here. But of course, Aristotle's father was also named Nicomachus, and so may have something to do with that as well. In any case, this is something of a personal book for Aristotle, and certainly he thinks of moral virtue as being part of the sort of thing that parents and their children ought to be very much concerned about passing on. So what I'm going to do here first is fill in a little bit of background prior to that occurs in the Nicomachean Ethics prior to the excerpt that is in the textbook, because I feel like it sort of completes the story a little bit. It helps to give Aristotle's account more of just a fuller explanation than just jumping in right into the middle. So very early in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle gives a kind of caveat, right? He gives a kind of warning. He says, okay, this is a book going to be about ethics. It's going to be about the good life. It's going to be about, living the best life, being the right way, cultivating the right sort of character and virtue. And he says, and before we ever start, really, it's important to note that you shouldn't expect more precision than the subject matter allows. Right? He's not going to be necessarily giving us a kind of mathematical style presentation here. And so he gives a kind of example. He says, wealth and courage, for example, are generally good things, but have on occasion contributed to the ruin of some people. And so it doesn't seem like if you're in his business, you can say wealth is always a good thing or courage is always a good thing, but you can certainly say it's generally good. And so the idea is that one should not expect precise proofs out of an ethicist or a political scientist because they have to deal with things that are just generally true. Or rather, the subjects that they deal with are very messy, right? There's a lot of detail in there that's not always important to the overall field. And similarly, one should not expect approximate proofs out of a mathematician who deals with things that are of a determinate and definite nature. And so I think this sort of a warning is just generally well taken and is generally a sign of intellectual maturity, not to expect more precision than the subject matter will allow in anything. So the first thing I wanted to bring up is something called the function argument, and I'm just going to go through it very, very briefly. Again, the purpose is not to make you some sort of an Aristotle scholar, but just to fill in some of the explanation for how he gets to his question about virtue, and I think it makes sense of how he approaches the question of virtue among human beings. And so here's how the function argument goes. It starts off with the very basic and very interesting observation that every action is aimed at some sort of a goal or end. Right? So every action has some kind of a goal in mind. You can see this kind of purposefulness in certainly not just human action, but in a lot of things. And so what Aristotle then points out is he says then accomplishing that goal is then the characteristic function of whoever aims at that goal. So in other words, what makes a thing what it is the goal that it is aimed at. For example, the characteristic function of a house builder is the goal of building good houses. The characteristic function of a flute player is playing the flute well. What makes a house builder is that they have the goal of building houses well. Nobody else has such a goal. Okay, so there's this notion of this characteristic function is very important, and that's essentially why we call this the function argument. There's a thing that the goal tends to make the action the kind of action that it is, right? Only the person doing that action would have that kind of goal because only having such a goal would make them do that action. It's approaching ethics from a very abstract level at this point. Now, of course, every goal has standards of quality that come with that particular goal, right? What makes, if you were building houses, what makes something a good house is not the same thing as, what makes something a good toaster. And so, again, the goal comes with some standards of quality, some ideas of achieving the goal well, or achieving it completely, or achieving it in a good way, as opposed to a bad way. And so the kinds of questions that come out of this very general argument are these sorts of questions, right? Uh, so we can conclude that human life has something like a characteristic function. So living, just being human, is certainly amounts to a whole set of actions. And so Aristotle says, what's the characteristic function then of human life? What is it that makes human life what it is, as opposed to something else? What goal is human life aimed at? In another sense, he's trying to say, what is our purpose? What are we for? Right? And that's, of course, as old a question about the human condition as anybody could ever ask. And so again, what is the goal of human life? And then of course, what are the standards of quality for it? How do you know when something is the best life for a human? And so Aristotle sort of sketches around, right? He says, look, if we're going to try and answer a question like this, we got to start defining our terms a little bit. We have to take a kind of careful approach. We have to really canvas around. We have to say, what do people generally say about the goals of human life? What do the wisest of us say about human life, etc. So it starts a lengthy process of examination, and he's very patient about this. And Aristotle says that he says pretty quickly you'll find that everybody agrees that the goal of human life is happiness, right? And it wouldn't be an Aristotle lecture if I didn't go into this. Basically, every time anybody gives you an Aristotle lecture, if they don't talk about the way that happiness, the word happiness, tends to get translated out of the Greek, I think they're probably doing a little bit of a disservice. But so far, I've never seen it happen. So here it goes. The way that happiness, the word happiness, gets translated out of the Greek is a little bit problematic. Okay. It's an unfortunate translation, but it's become sort of tradition to translate a particular Greek word as happiness, and people have stuck with it, even though most translators will eventually put in footnotes or something like that. They say, yeah, it's just a little unfortunate. All right, so when the modern English speaker thinks of the word happiness, what they think of is this sort of a feeling of being happy, right? Something like pleasure, essentially, which is how it comes to be associated with early utilitarians like Bentham and Mill, and when they talk about happiness, what they really mean is pleasure. They mean a feeling of happiness. They don't mean the same thing that Aristotle meant by what the word he used that we translate as happiness. The word Aristotle used, you see it here spelled in Greek. If you transliterate that into the Roman alphabet, it's pronounced eudaimonia, right? Which means something a lot more like well-being or fulfillment than it is happiness. It's a state of being more than it is some feeling or other. And so Aristotle does not mean to suggest, when he says that the goal of human life is happiness, that the goal of human life is to feel a certain way. He thinks the goal of human life is something like, again, well-being or fulfillment, right? The idea is to accomplish some sort of a real goal of human life, as opposed to just to feel a certain way. But of course, this leaves unanswered the question, what actually does eudaimonia consist of? Like, what makes somebody's life actually go well for them? What is this well-being or fulfillment that he calls eudaimonia? And of course, Aristotle himself realizes this is, ask everybody, they say it's happiness or eudaimonia, but nobody really agrees what eudaimonia is, right? And once you start to ask different sorts of folks, you'll get all sorts of different answers. And so one of the things that Aristotle does is he sort of dismisses some answers that sometimes you hear to this question, some of the popular answers, as it were. And so, he says, when you ask people around and say, what is happiness? One group of people, say the masses, right? So, the hoi polloi, right? The common clay, as it were, say that the life of pleasure is happiness, right? They tend to think of happiness as just a kind of feeling. Aristotle doesn't think much of this definition. He thinks that's sort of very vulgar in the sense of common, right? And not fitting of a human being. Right. He's thinking, that it's mostly just your sort of unwashed masses that have this kind of an attitude. No seriously thoughtful person, he thinks, really equates happiness or a life well lived with mere pleasure. And of course, if you recall the sort of philosophy of swine objection to the hedonistic part of utilitarianism, that's at least as old as Aristotle, and the version of it that that Mill discusses is probably very much derived from Aristotle's objection here. Aristotle also rejects a different answer. He rejects the answer that we would call them politicians. He would say, statesmen or something like that. You could either one. People who are very much involved in the governing of the city, right? They say that happiness is in honor, right? But of course, Aristotle points out that requires other people to honor you, right? Surely somebody could live well without others honoring them for it. So he thinks that honor is, again, a kind of secondary thing. It might be nice, but it sure can't be what we really mean by the virtue, the characteristic function of a human life. So what Aristotle does then is he contrasts three different sorts of lives that you might lead with three different kinds of goals. The first he talks about is the life that has the goal of mere survival, right? This is something like the vegetative life. This is the life of pure growth, and that's all. And he thinks this can't be the kind of goal that human life really has. Just mere survival cannot be our purpose because, of course, even plants do this, right? Plants live this life of mere survival. And so, if we were only meant to live a life of survival, it wouldn't seem like we needed anything more than plants have. And of course, it seems like we do have so many things that plants do not have. And so, why? What sort of different goal are human beings equally or much better suited for pursuing? He considers the life of pleasure, right? This is what when we were just sort of talking about. He calls this the animal life, right? Again, he says this cannot be the characteristic life of a person because, again, even animals do this. So there must be more to life for us. Cats, dogs, pigs, etc. They can simply pursue basic pleasures their whole lives, and that seems to be fine for them. Again, we have something that they lack, and so it seems like the goal for our life should have to be correspondingly different. And so then Aristotle concludes that it must be the thing that we are uniquely suited for, that must be our characteristic function, that must be the goal of human life, is something that only humans can partake of. And he thinks that that is the life of virtue and reflection. He thinks this really is the best life for a human because, again, only human beings can live the life of virtue and reflection, right? This uses our faculty of reason, which is often what sets us apart from the rest of nature as we know it. And so this then must be the characteristic function or of human life. So there's Aristotle's function argument very briefly. So he comes up with this idea that because humans uniquely can pursue the life of virtue and reflection, that must indicate that that's what we're really for, right? That's in some sense what we're designed for, right? That we're meant to live this life of virtue and reflection, that is the best life for us. And so this brings up a rather interesting point. We've seen in most of the other moral theories. So, for example, if we take a look at utilitarianism, sometimes the action that really is morally required of you, that is the action that creates the best overall consequences, might not be any good for you at all. In fact, it may be perfectly terrible for you. After all, if the one action available to you that created the absolute best overall consequences, was to simply kill yourself, then again, it seems like utilitarianism would say that morality requires that of you, and that's just an interesting thing about utilitarianism. But of course, Kant, in sort of a rare bit of overlap, tends to agree with this, that what morality demands of you is not necessarily good for you. It doesn't necessarily fit anything that you want. It doesn't necessarily fit anything that brings you any kind of joy. And it doesn't necessarily make your life any better for you, except insofar as that you are following the moral law, right? So, it's a kind of obligation that doesn't necessarily have any benefits other than simply being the kind of person who would follow the moral law. Well, Aristotle believes that virtue and prudence really do go hand in hand to a much greater degree than some of these action-centered theories of ethics would say. Um, For example, what he argues then is that the best life for a person, that is the most prudent life. Prudence is a word we use for people sort of looking after their own interests, right? Themselves, taking care of themselves, in other words, just is the life of virtue, right? Aristotle really thinks that the life of virtue is the best life a person can lead, the best life for them, and really the best life for any human being. And so rather than saying, we have moral duties that may not lead to the best things for us, Aristotle really does think that morality is in the end the best thing for us. Being the right person is the best thing for us. And so again, recall those three lives, the life of survival, like the life of pleasure, or the life of virtue and reflection. It really may be that somebody, like, at least thinks they want to live the life of the pig in the mud, but this person does not have a refined set of desires that are really appropriate for human happiness. I think we would probably feel sorry for such a person, right? I mean, look, all of us every now and then really just want to lay on the couch and eat some, potato chips and do nothing, right? That's a thing. But certainly a life lived that way, I think we would probably feel sorry for somebody who couldn't imagine a life better than that. Couldn't imagine better things to do, or much less feel a desire to do those things. And so that's essentially where Aristotle's coming from. And so to take us into the area where the text is going to pick up here, Aristotle writes this kind of, he gives a kind of analogical argument here. And so I'm going to go ahead and read the quote, even though you could sort of pause and read it yourself, because we'll want to parse this pretty carefully. So one of the things he writes in the Nicomachean Ethics, he says, pleasure is a state of the soul, and to each person that which they are said to be a lover of is pleasant. You'll have to forgive the way that people tend to translate. When you're really familiar with the sort of, Greek or Latin word order, things like that, it tends to be really hard to translate it really literally into English and then make it sound like natural sounding English. So sometimes it sounds a little stilted like this, a little bit Yoda-ish, but it's just a thing that happens to translators. So he says, for example, not only is a horse pleasant to the lover of horses, right? So the idea is, if you really love horses, then when you see one, you get a little pleasure out of seeing them. People who really love dogs, they see a dog on the street, they say, "Oh, it's a dog," right? They get this sort of pleasurable feeling. Um, he says, a spectacle to the lover of sights, but also in the same way, just acts are pleasant to the lover of justice, and in general, virtuous acts to the lover of virtue. Now, of course, the kinds of things we enjoy here are not just objects, right? But we enjoy certain kinds of people. We enjoy certain things conceptually, right? And so he brings in somebody who might love justice or might love virtue. He says, for most people, their pleasures are in conflict with one another because these are not by nature pleasant. But the lovers of what is noble find pleasant the things that are by nature pleasant, and virtuous actions are such, so that these are pleasant for such people as in their own nature, right? Again, that takes some unpacking. He says that sometimes, like, if you just have a lot of different things that you like, right, you might have a hard time because some of those things that you like might be sort of in conflict with each other. You can't have them all at the same time. But he says if you adjust the kinds of things that you like to include something like virtues, for example, then you get a much more unified psychology, right? A much more unified character in the sense that you take pleasure in a certain range of things that are virtuous. Okay, and he continues this way. He says their life, meaning the life of the virtuous, therefore, has no further need of pleasure as a sort of adventitious charm, but it has pleasure in itself. For besides what we have said, the one who does not rejoice in noble actions is not even good, since no one would call someone just who did not enjoy acting justly, nor anyone liberal who did not enjoy liberal actions, and similarly in all other cases. If this is so, virtuous actions must be in themselves pleasant. Right, this is a very interesting argument. Um, and what he says this, right? So again, if a lover of horses takes pleasure in seeing a horse, and the lover of great scenery likes looking at good scenery, right? He says, just imagine what the life of the person who loves virtue must be like if they themselves are also virtuous. Because in loving a thing, they tend to pursue it, right? And if they really do align their desires, really do train themselves to love virtue, then they start to live a virtuous life. And since they love virtue, then they, by extension, love their own life, right? So this is his argument for why the life of virtue really is the best life for a person. Because, of course, you can't be virtuous without loving virtue. Again, as he puts it, the one who does not rejoice in noble actions is not even good, right? So you can't just do the right thing for the wrong reason for Aristotle. You have to really, be virtuous because it's virtue, right? So you have to train yourself to love the virtue, and then when you love virtue and are virtuous, you don't need any extra pleasures. Your life itself is its own best reward. So again, that's his argument. It's a very interesting argument for morality being what's actually the best life for us. And so, again, the analogy is that to be a lover of the best life means to be pleased by it. And so in order to live the best life, we have to be able to modify our character traits to fit with taking pleasure in the life of virtue. Notice I've bolded this notion of character traits because that brings in a kind of important definition that we'll have to settle before we move on. So a character trait is this. This is how I'm going to define a character trait for our purposes. A character trait is a stable disposition to act in a certain way in certain circumstances. So the idea is that it's a stable disposition. What that means is that it's a tendency, right? It's not necessarily sort of a hard and fast rule, but it's a tendency that doesn't tend to change very quickly or very easily. Right? So again, imagine a very honest person. Might an honest person tell a lie about this, that, or some other occasional thing? Sure. But the idea is that in general, in any normal circumstance, they will be disposed. That is, they will tend to simply tell the truth without necessarily thinking about whether they ought to or not, right? It's just simply a part of their character. It's a stable disposition to act in a certain way in certain circumstances. And of course, if the circumstances are extraordinary, you then wouldn't expect ordinary kinds of dispositions to apply. And that's something that, again, Aristotle wants to say. The reality on the ground is messy, and don't expect more precision than the subject matter will allow. And so there's a connection then between desires and character traits. And desires are just one part then of what we'll eventually start to call character. So a character trait is, again, it's this stable disposition to act in a certain way in certain circumstances, right? And one example we can give here is that, say, a generous person is disposed to give when they see need. But that, again, doesn't mean that there's this ironclad, hard and fast rule. Every time they see a need, they give, right? It's just they're certainly disposed to do that. And again, often modern persons regard desires as things that just sort of come with a person, that either can't or shouldn't be changed. However, we often seek to raise children with positive character traits, for example, like honesty or patience, that's a big one, and to teach them to then avoid negative character traits like selfishness or bad tempers or various things like this. And in a way, what we try and do is we try and change people's ideas of what sorts of things are good about even themselves, what sorts of things they sort of enjoy, what kind of people they enjoy being. And so it very much, a lot of our sort of practical wisdom, a lot of the way in which we in fact lead our lives does very much correspond with Aristotle's assertions here that, that one has to modify their character over time very slowly to try and develop into the virtuous person. And so one more example of some of our modern struggles to modify our desires are struggles with sort of addictions or other, as we might call it, bad habits, right? And our approach to these is very reminiscent of the way that Aristotle approached ethics in general. So, for example, imagine a person might decide to quit smoking because of a number of things. They might say that life is longer and more pleasant without smoking, right? Maybe their physical health. They might wish to be a better example to children, right? That's certainly something that I know lots of people, quit smoking when they are, expecting children or when they have young children, that they all of a sudden now find themselves as examples to those young people. Or they might say that smoking is inhibiting other kinds of virtuous behaviors like sociability or even financial management because it's expensive, or some other thing. And what these motivations do is they generally match a desire to live the life of reflection and virtue, that is, to live the best kind of life. and to try and modify the sorts of things that we desire, right? You sort of have to practice doing without cigarettes, because uh, in some sense you don't want to smoke, but in some sense you crave it, and what ends up happening is you have to end up training, right, your desires to desire not smoking a lot more than you desire smoking in any particular time. And so you tend to try and beat the cravings until they sort of lessen and lessen. And this is, again, it's a changing of the strength of one's desires over time. And so this is where the excerpt in the text picks up, right? So Aristotle has given us an idea of what a good human life is, and thinks it's the idea. The idea is that the good life, right, is the life of virtue that you get by some kind of habituation. You get it by some kind of training, um, and uh, and of course, how does that work? And what are you supposed to actually train yourself to do? Like, what is virtue? These are the questions that the excerpt that is in the Schaefer-Landau text picks right up with addressing. And so very early in that excerpt, we have this from Aristotle about acquiring and modifying our character traits, right? He says, the virtues we get by exercising them, as happens also in the case of the arts as well. For the things we have to learn before we can do them, we learn by doing them. For example, men become builders by building and lyre players by playing the lyre. So too, we become just by doing just acts. We become temperate by doing temperate acts, etc. And we become brave by doing brave acts. This is confirmed by what happens in states, he means governments. For legislators make the citizens good by forming habits in them. And this is the wish of every legislator, and those who do not effect it miss their mark. And it is in this that a good constitution differs from a bad one. But I think, look, just in society in general, what we want is we want people to gain good habits, right? And the only way to gain good habits is to actually practice doing those good things, practice avoiding those bad things. And so if we want to be virtuous, we have to start acting virtuous, right? So you use certainly action is important to a virtue ethicist, but it's a kind of secondary thing. What's really important is the character, and the action is the thing that both builds and in some cases reveals that character. So very much of Aristotle concerns habituation and training. That is, forming habits, training oneself to be virtuous. So he says, for example, we modify all these character traits we have by habituation and training. At some point, somebody has to teach us or show us what it means to be trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, cheerful, obedient, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent, for example, just to pick a few virtues out of perhaps nowhere. And this is what is meant by training. And again, it's most effective with the young. Right? This is the sort of thing we tend to really focus on with young people. Of course, it's never too late to grow and learn and become more virtuous. And so beyond mere training, we have to form habits that make virtuous behavior part of our nature. That's what we really mean by habituation or training. The idea is not just to practice for the sake of practicing, but to practice for the sake of changing ourselves. Right? When you practice something, you start doing it much more automatic. Right? If you've ever played tennis or worked on a golf swing or something like that, you'll know that right at first you're terrible and you're thinking about everything. Right? You're thinking about your form, you're thinking about what's going on, you're thinking about, and then of course as you get more and more and more practice, a lot of those things just become automatic. They become the things you don't really think about anymore, but just do. That's exactly what Aristotle means with respect to morality. He says that you should train yourself in virtuous behavior. You have to identify it. You have to think about it a lot at first. But then the idea is, as you practice doing it and doing it and doing it, you become the sort of person that just does those sorts of things without even thinking about them. You do them automatically. It becomes just a part of who you are. And so then when you get a bad habit, it often takes even more effort to first break the bad habit and then replace it with a good one, right? Um, and again, as a good example, many ex-smokers oftentimes replace time spent smoking with exercise or other kinds of worthy pursuits, right, to try and replace a bad habit with a good one. But it takes a tremendous amount of effort because you have to first undo the bad one and then do the good one, instead of just starting from a neutral place, just learning the good one. And so if we're following Aristotle this far, again, we might then ask how we determine which character traits are virtuous. That's all fine and good. We want to become virtuous. We want to do it automatically. How do you know what's virtue? right? And that's where his approach is, again, very creative, very interesting, and very, shall I say, commonsensical in a very interesting way. And so here's what he says. He says, first then, let us consider this, that it is the nature of such things to be destroyed by defect and excess. As we see in the case of strength and of health, for to gain light on things imperceptible, we must use the evidence of sensible things. Both excessive and defective exercise destroys the strength. Similarly, drink or food which is above or below a certain amount destroys the health. While that which is proportionate both produces and increases and preserves it. So too it is then that in the case of temperance and courage and the other virtues. So again, he says that this is a very interesting thing. It's like, well, look, too much food and too little food will destroy the health. It's only the right amount that will actually increase it. And so likewise with the virtues, too much of something will end up sort of destroying the virtue, it will make a bad habit instead of a good habit. Too little of something, right, would make it a bad habit instead of a good habit. And it's really just the right amount that makes it good. And so he introduces this general method that Aristotle follows, right? He says that there are three kinds of disposition. This is another quote from Aristotle. Two of them vices involving excess and deficiency respectively, and one a virtue, fidelis et, the mean. So every character trait is expressed by some name or other, right? People have names for personality traits. We just do. We have you can probably think of 100 different types of personality traits right now if you were to make a list. And of course, any competent speaker of our language knows whether such names describe good or bad character traits. Things like honesty obviously describes a good character trait, right? Shiftiness describes a bad character trait, right? And so again, you can come up with as many ways of describing people's character as you like, but you know which ones are good and which ones aren't. And so Aristotle says we can learn a lot about virtue by just sort of doing a little bit of lexicography here, just organizing all these words, collecting all the good ones, seeing what they have in common, collecting all the bad ones, seeing what they have in common, and that's kind of where he gets this method. And so he says that all of these good words, right, describe virtues. And of course, the bad ones describe either a vice of deficiency, that is a lack of a particular attribute, or else a vice of excess, which is too much of a particular attribute. So a virtue is a good piece of personal character. A vice is a bad piece of personal character. And so oftentimes the way that Aristotle or other people explain this is by looking for something like the golden mean, right? This middle ground between two extremes and sort of everywhere, right? And of course, this leads to a common misinterpretation of Aristotle. Sometimes people will interpret Aristotle as saying something like everything in moderation. Well, I mean, that's not entirely true. Aristotle certainly does think that virtue often exists between two extremes, one being having not enough of a particular trait and the other having too much of that trait. And he thinks there is a good middle ground between the excess and the deficiency. However, cowardice is a deficiency. It's a deficiency of bravery. So cowardice is not good in moderation any more than cyanide is good in moderation, right? There are some things that are just bad, right? So again, there's a difference between saying that you want everything in moderation and saying that virtues often exist between two extremes, right? So again, cowardice is what happens when someone lacks courage. Courage is the virtue, and when somebody lacks courage, they have the vice of deficiency of courage called cowardice. So when it's too much courage, they have the vice of excess called rashness or recklessness, right? And so rashness or recklessness aren't good in moderation. It's that bravery or courage, which is a moderate between having too much or too little of a particular thing. That's what's good. And again, there seem to be as many virtues as there are positive ways to describe character. But some of the virtues that Aristotle tends to discuss frequently are as follows. So some of the ones he tends to think of as core virtues that do tend to have a lot to do with specifically the moral life. One of these is temperance, that is, the ability to resist what one ought to resist, even if, or especially if, it is pleasant. Right? This is just a very important life skill for anybody to have, and certainly it's important for living the moral life. Knowing when things are sort of best left alone, right? You can maybe enjoy it a little bit, but you know when to leave it alone. You can exert temperance. And again, that probably requires some degree of training, practice, and discretion. But I'm sure you can think of people who lack temperance, probably people you actually know, who seem like they just cannot ever resist something that is pleasant, and oftentimes to their detriment. And so the vice of deficiency is called something like intemperance or licentiousness or syncretism or overindulgence and essentially people who satisfy their appetites to too great a degree or with too much frequency, right? We know that that probably doesn't lead to the best overall life. But of course, you can be too temperate, right? You can be sort of an ascetic, right? Refers to this group of people sort of tend to whip themselves and wear hair shirts and all that sort of stuff. That is foregoing things which really are acceptable to partake of, right? So the temperate person need not turn down all pleasures, but really ought to know when to turn them down and to be able to do so. That's really the virtue of temperance. And again, to be able to do so more or less automatically as a part of the character. Fortitude is in some ways the other side of the coin. So fortitude is the ability to pursue what one ought to pursue, even if it's unpleasant. And again, this is a really important life skill. Being adult is all about doing all kinds of things you don't really want to do, but just have to be done, right? So this is the "it's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it" virtue. And of course, you can imagine many people who are deficient in fortitude. We tend to refer to these people as weak or irresolute or, in general, just not being able to do what needs to be done. But of course, you can have too much fortitude. These are people we often call sort of a glutton for punishment, right? And so generally, a person should not seek out unpleasantness, right? And should be somewhat deterred by it. If you have two different ways of accomplishing something worthwhile, one of which is unpleasant and the other which will do quite well without the unpleasantness, choose the one without the unpleasantness, right? So things that are unpleasant should deter you, but the idea is that they shouldn't stop you from doing what needs to be done. Right, so that's fortitude, is the ability to persevere in that sense. Some other virtues that Aristotle tends to mention that sort of follow this method of looking for a mean between the excess of vice and excess of deficiency are things like friendliness. Humans are social creatures, right? And so friendliness is definitely a virtue, and it's a kind of middle ground between being sort of clingy and it's like too friendly, or cold, right? Not friendly enough. Truthfulness, of course, we should want to be truthful. We should want, by our natures, to tend to say that which we believe to be true. And that means not being a liar. It would be having a deficiency of truthfulness. In fact, that tends to be how we tell children not to lie. We say, look, no one likes a liar, right? We put it in terms of a character trait, not necessarily in the case of, oh, well, in any given situation, one ought not to, whatever. But of course, we also don't like it when people are too honest, right? Sometimes there's just a time for keeping your mouth shut, or not necessarily saying everything that's on your mind. People who don't seem to have that, we call them sort of blunt or rude or perhaps some other things. But that's a kind of excess of truthfulness. Right? It becomes a vice if you have it in too great a degree. Wit, right? One of the things that he thought distinguishes us, not just reason, from other animals, is that we laugh at stuff, right? We have this sort of humor. It seems to be uniquely human, and so wit is going to be a very important kind of a virtue. But of course, you can have an excess you can have a deficiency of wit, right, in being humorless, or you can have an excess of it if you're just some kind of a clown, if you just can't ever be serious. But of course, wit is going to be one of those things in between, right? When it's appropriate to be funny, you should be funny and you should recognize humor where appropriate. But if all you can do is just clown around and laugh at stuff, then you have an excess, you have a vice. If you just can't ever laugh at anything, that's again a kind of deficiency. And of course, the king of all the virtues is going to be wisdom. Okay, probably the best of all the virtues. And wisdom is essentially being able to discern truths about the virtues, right? Knowing what is an excess and what's a deficiency, right? Finding the mean in various areas, knowing what the virtuous person would do in a given circumstance. All this is the result of the virtue of wisdom, which again has to come with practice. It has to be cultivated and developed. You don't just get it for free. Um, nor any of the other virtues. You have to again work to make it part of your character. And of course, this one is kind of an exception to the general rule, because and remember, you should only expect as much precision as the subject matter will allow. So you shouldn't necessarily expect that every virtue comes neatly sandwiched in between this vice of excess and this vice of deficiency, because wisdom, a very important core virtue, doesn't really have a vice of excess. Certainly, there's a vice of deficiency, right? Someone deficient in wisdom is a fool, but can you imagine having too much wisdom, right? Certainly, there's a problem with thinking that you have more wisdom than you actually have, but that's actually just a way of being a fool, right? It's not actually having enough wisdom. Is there a way to actually have too much wisdom, actually know too much of the truth, of virtue? I mean, that doesn't really seem possible. We should all want as much wisdom as we can get. And so again, it's a sort of exception. It does not have a vice of excess. It certainly, though, has a vice of deficiency, and certainly wisdom is a virtue, certainly one of the most important virtues. So it's at this point that we have to briefly say now, how does anybody use any of this information? And that's where we're going to sort of move on to some other readings. Certainly, Schaefer Landau is going to start to explain how a person goes about employing these kinds of insights about the good life, about virtue, about how to identify virtue, and about sort of this encouragement to habituate and train yourself to be virtuous. And what that means for various particular situations and situations we can imagine arising through our investigation of this as an ethical theory. But mostly, I do want to emphasize how much of a kind of common sense approach this is, how much this really does mirror the way that we tend to want to train ourselves, our children, the way we tend to talk to the people we care about their lives and about what sorts of lives would really be best for them or for us. Um, And so do direct your attention to the Schaefer Landau to start working out some of the interesting sort of nuts and bolts of how virtue ethics as a theory gets developed, because this is its origin. It comes here from Aristotle, and very much of Aristotle's approach is preserved all the way to the present in a lot of cases with modern ethicists who are working on developing virtue ethics.